I am right now just absolutely thrilled to be here. This event wouldn't have happened. It was put together very recently, and it was a joint effort between folks here at Emory University as well as at RZIM, and so I'm thrilled. Thank you so much for organizing this. Can we give all the volunteers and all the organizers a round of applause? Emory University, I don't know if you know this, but Emory University is one of the highest ranked universities for graduate study of religion every single year. One of the top 5 pretty consistently. And some amazing studies happening here, some amazing people and minds involved in the university, so I'm absolutely honored with the opportunity to be able to speak here tonight. A lot of you who are watching this or who have come in from afar might not know, but Atlanta is a pretty cool place to be. This is the home of Chick-fil-A, so it doesn't get much better. But just to make sure it does get better, it's also the home of Coca-Cola, not Pepsi. RZIM does not endorse Coca-Cola, just tossing that out there. So right off the bat, this is a great place to be. The weather's turning up. It's almost Easter time, and so as we move into these items, I know there's a lot of excitement here, a lot of pride here for Atlanta, for Emory University. It's an exciting thing. Unfortunately, we also see things in the news pretty regularly about Atlanta as well, such as the fact that this is the #1 spot in the United States for sex slaves and sex trafficking. This is something that only continually seems to get worse. Just yesterday in the news, we saw a sting by the FBI where 5 more people were arrested for keeping sex slaves. One of them from Atlanta, they were arrested in Augusta. So this is also kind of the milieu in which we think, in which we move forward. So being here in Atlanta, we have some great things to be excited about, but we also have some things to be very seriously considering about the world around us. And I think Christianity and the gospel, specifically Easter, and what we're going to be talking about in a few moments, has a lot to say about both joy and about suffering, the suffering of those who are right here in Atlanta under this kind of slavery. The gospel is very relevant to these matters, especially the issue of Jesus' death and resurrection, which we're going to be discussing. So the matter of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, even though we're at this prestigious university, shouldn't be seen as something that's academically removed from us, or some kind of a historical investigation, or perhaps some kind of theological matter that may or may not pertain to us as it's related to reality. No, the gospel message, whether or not Jesus died and rose from the dead, and who he claimed to be, has such an impact in our lives that I dare say it's the question that has the greatest implication. What you do with the question, who is Jesus and did he rise from the dead, is perhaps the most important thing you will ever do in your life. Now, in my case, I believed not that Jesus had risen from the dead when I was a child. Far from it. I was raised as a Muslim here in the United States, and the idea that Jesus even died on the cross was contrary to what I had been taught. And in fact, a position that I had argued from childhood was that, of course, Jesus didn't die on the cross. If he didn't die, he couldn't have risen from the dead. So it wasn't just something incidental to my beliefs as a Muslim. I vehemently argued that Jesus didn't die on the cross. And yet I stand here before you specifically because the evidence of Jesus' death and resurrection was that compelling to me. I want to emphasize that again. It was the evidence that got me to move into the direction of accepting whether or not Jesus had died and risen from the dead. Islam to me was a religion I loved. It was a religion I loved following. It was a religion of my family. And for me, it would cost a lot to accept this message of Easter. But the evidence was that compelling, and I hope to present that information to you today. If you're wrestling with these matters, I'm here to assure you that the evidence is quite strong. Now, some people might say, Nabeel, the idea of Jesus rising from the dead, how could that possibly be something that we can investigate historically? And this is a pretty common assertion, that historians can only investigate that which falls under the realm of naturalism. The idea of whether Jesus had risen from the dead or not falls outside of that question. And in fact, there was an author very recently who wrote a book. The book's called Zealot. The author's name is Reza Aslan. He's a Muslim scholar in the southwestern part of the United States. He argues that exact same thing. As a Muslim, he argues that if you believe Jesus has risen from the dead, you're believing in something that requires faith. It's not a good historical assertion. Well, is that really the case? We know back from the Enlightenment era that Hume argued similar matters, that any kind of miracle cannot be argued from an evidential or historical perspective. And even to today, Hume's thought keeps impacting biblical scholars. Reza Aslan is not one, but people like Bart Ehrman have argued on the record that you cannot investigate the resurrection historically. It's a miracle if it happened, and miracles are outside the realm of history. So right off the bat, before we dive into these things, it's important that we clarify our semantics, because unless we're on the same page, we're not going to be able to move forward. How we're defining history today is those set of events that happened in the past. That set of events that happened in the past, that's history. The narrow definition of history, that set of events which we can only explain naturalistically, is what a lot of historians assume before they address the question. Well, you can see the problem right off the bat. If historians assume that history has to be done naturalistically, apart from any miracles, then before you've even looked at the question, did Jesus rise from the dead, you've already answered it by saying, no, that's not a historical thing we can take a look at. Are you with me so far? The lights are pretty bright, but I can see you, and I'm going to be using you to gauge whether you're following me or not. So far, are we together on this one? So unless you employ circular reasoning and you say that Jesus' death and resurrection cannot be investigated and proven by history, we do have good reason to be able to say that if the resurrection is the best, and definitely if it's the only, explanation of the facts, then we have good reason to accept the resurrection as a historical conclusion. And that's the position that I'm going to be taking today. The last thing I'm going to look at before delving into the evidence is, what about this idea of faith and religion? What about that? Because the Protestant motto has been, it's by grace and faith alone that we are saved. Saved by faith in the grace of Jesus. So how is it possible that we can turn to evidence in order to look and see whether or not we should believe in Christianity? Shouldn't we just believe by faith? This is an inappropriate definition of faith. It's patently unbiblical. The Bible says that we're supposed to have good reasons for the faith that we have. And in case anyone asks us for our faith, we should have an answer or a defense to be able to give for our faith. This is a commonly quoted verse of the New Testament, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. You need to have reasons for the faith you have so that you can share those reasons with other people. How compelling is it when someone tells you to believe in Christianity and they say, why? And you say, oh, you should just believe it, just have faith. It's not what the Bible tells us. And in fact, that was a large part of the problem I had growing up when I was a Muslim. I used to encounter Christian after Christian after Christian. When I challenged them on whether or not Christianity was true, they would just say, well, that's what I believe. I say, well, okay, so it's what you believe, but why are you asking me to then believe it if you don't have good reason? Now, I extrapolate that kind of question to things like the Trinity. If you really want to give a Christian a run for their money, just ask them to define the Trinity. And they'll say, well, the Trinity is the idea that God is three in one. What does that mean? It's a mystery. No, the only mystery here is why you believe this. God is three in one. What is he, a shampoo bottle? No, give me the explanation of what Jesus is. And so, as I'm investigating Christianity, I'm running into these problems that people are not willing to give an explanation for their faith. And I'm challenging you here today, if you are a Christian, make sure you stand by that command of 1 Peter 3:15 to be ready to give a defense for the faith that you have. Now, the resurrection is pivotal for that. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 14 and 17, he says, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. Notice he's not saying whether Jesus is risen or not, this belief helps us get through life, which is how a lot of people interpret religion, as a crutch to help you get through life, as a crutch to help you deal with death. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying the exact opposite. If this did not happen, if Jesus is not risen, our faith is in vain, and we are of all people most to be pitied. We're deluded. We're following a lie if Jesus is not risen. So you take a look at what Paul's asserting, and he is saying that the resurrection is the linchpin of the Christian faith. Well, what about those in the book of Acts? What about Jesus? What do they have to say about the resurrection? In the book of Acts, when people start preaching the gospel, what you don't hear them saying is, do you know you're going to get to heaven? Do you want to be saved? Do you want to live a better life? That's not the kind of thing they're saying. You see, the very first sermon from Peter in Acts chapter 2 was explicitly about, at its culmination, the resurrection. This man Jesus has risen from the dead. Repent and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. The resurrection. As you continue through the book of Acts, time after time after time, it's the resurrection that people are pointing to. And you might ask me, well, Nabeel, what if it's just to a specific audience? You know, Peter was talking to the Jews in that occasion. Maybe the Jews are thinking about resurrection in a certain way, and therefore it's Peter just addressing the Jews. No, interestingly enough, the first time we see something on a scale towards philosophers and towards thinkers in the Greco-Roman world is in Acts chapter 17. And here Paul is in Athens, in the Areopagus. He's speaking to not Jews, but exactly to Greco-Romans, to Stoics. As Paul goes along, he even quotes basically Greco-Roman poetry. Menander is quoted there. You also see some things that are said which are very close to the writings of Seneca, a Stoic philosopher. So you see Paul interacting with Greco-Roman poetry and philosophy, but as he does that, the culminating message once again is Jesus' resurrection. We believe in this because this man Jesus rose from the dead. Now, how does it work? How does it work? Jesus himself was asked the question. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus was asked the question, why should we listen to you? Essentially, that's what the question was asking. People were, literally, so I can be more accurate to the source, people were saying to Jesus, Jesus, show us a sign. Show us a sign for why we should listen to the kinds of things you're saying. Jesus had just exorcised a demon-possessed boy. So they're like, show us a sign. He's like, did you not see what he just exorcised a demon? And then he responds to them and he says, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign. Essentially, you're ignoring this. I will not give you any sign except for the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, so shall the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth. What is Jesus saying? He's saying, I'm going to give you one proof for the claims I am stating, and that is that as Jonah was apparently dead in the heart of a whale, I am going to be dead in the belly of the earth. Sheol is the word that's used. Sheol is the Hebrew word for the grave. But then I'm going to return. Just as Jonah returned, I am going to return. The resurrection is Jesus' statement, his proof, his epistemically provided evidence that he is actually who he claims to be. The fact of the matter is, there are a lot of religious claims where people can be just given a set of beliefs. I remember when I was talking to a Buddhist. This was my friend. I went to Old Dominion University for my undergraduate, and I had a Buddhist friend named Zach. And one day I asked Zach, and this is while I was preaching Islam to him, and I said, Zach, I've given you good reasons to accept Islam. Why should I be a Buddhist? Why should I accept the faith that you follow? Can you give me your reasons? And he said, Nabeel, I don't think you're seeing Buddhism correctly. Buddhism isn't the kind of religion that provides people reasons to believe it. It's a path that you can follow, and if you choose to follow it, you can. And I said, well, thank you. I won't. Because I need a reason to change everything that I'm doing to follow what you're doing. I need it to at least be better somehow, or to be grounded in some kind of truth. And Buddhism isn't that kind of religion, or philosophy if you want to call it. Hinduism is the same thing. It's not providing you any kind of epistemic proof for its claims. And frankly, Judaism works in the same direction. Judaism works off of testimony from further back, what people have said and passed down to their children. If you remember in the book of Joshua, it's told for people to build altars of rocks so that they can pass to their children the things that God had done. But at no point are they challenging others to find evidence for their faith. This is something that's very limited to a few religious beliefs, and Christianity is one of them. Now, you would rightly be critiquing me right now if you said, Nabeel, you're quoting the Bible pretty willy-nilly. I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in the inspiration of the Bible. Why should I accept these references that you are giving? Fair enough. And that was, in fact, the exact same challenge I gave when I was a Muslim. I don't believe in the Bible. I don't believe in its reliability. So why should I listen to the quotations you're providing? Let's look at the nature of the evidence, the historical evidence that we're going to use to build the case for the resurrection before continuing. The Bible is not one book. Some people approach the Bible as if it was one writing, and if it's biased, we throw it out, we can't use it. That is a very short-sighted way to see the Bible. The Bible is actually 66 books, 39 Old Testament, and when Jesus comes, and you have 27 New Testament books. Those books have different genres. They say different things in different ways. I'm not saying contradictory things, but they're saying different things in different ways. They have different voices and different genres. For example, you read the book of Ecclesiastes and Lamentations, those two books, you read that differently from how you would read, say, the book of Romans. The book of Romans is a book on theology. Ecclesiastes, parts of Psalms, Lamentations, are a book of the expression of the human heart. You read the book of the Gospels separately from the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is a book of prophecy, whereas the Gospels are Greco-Roman bioi, they're historical biographies. So they have different genres. You don't approach them the same way. To do so would be to inappropriately approach the Bible in hermeneutics. Different books are intended to be read in different ways. And so let's just say, for example, and I'm not arguing this, but let's just say that someone said, Nabeel, I can't trust the book of Genesis. It says that the universe was made in 6 days, and I can't trust that kind of thing. Okay, fair enough. But that doesn't affect the reliability from a historical perspective of the four Gospels. You see where I'm going with this? The four Gospels were written later by different people in a totally different genre. So let's not inappropriately equate two books and impute one to the other. So first, the Bible, multiple books written by multiple authors. Well, what about that then? Are these reliable still? I haven't answered the question whether any of these are historically reliable. We need to assess the weight of these evidences for what they're worth. The New Testament, like I said, 27 books. The first 5 of those purport to be historical records. From Matthew to Mark to Luke to John, and then the book of Acts, which is actually Luke part B. The same author wrote that second. So it's often called Luke Acts. Those 5 books are attempting to provide historical evidence. So like any book of history then, we should weigh them for their historical records. How far removed are they from Jesus, whom they're reporting about? Jesus lived somewhere between, or he died somewhere between 30 and 33 AD. The Gospel of Mark, which is the first of the 4 Gospels to have been written, is at latest dated 72 AD. At latest. A lot of scholars, I as well, am very comfortable dating it around 50 AD, mid-50s, late 50s, somewhere around there. Some people move it even earlier, and they have good reason to do that, by the way. If you have any questions about this, we're going to have a Q&A time. I think there's good reasons to see portions of the Gospel of Mark coming from the 30s, so within 10 years of Jesus' death. But I'm trying to be as amenable to the skeptics as possible and say, even if it is 40 years after Jesus died, that's still within the lifetime of his companions. It's still within the lifetimes of the community of people living around Jesus. And so if the early Christian community is passing this stuff around, they are there to correct any kind of historical inaccuracies. They're still alive. Matthew and Luke come within the next few decades. John is written somewhere between 90 to 95 AD. Again, at the latest. Some of the greatest biblical scholars alive today, such as Daniel Wallace, who's at Dallas Theological Seminary, he would put the Gospel of John no later than the mid-60s. So some people even put it that early, but at the latest, people put it at 90 to 95 AD. That's within 60 years of Jesus' life. And we know people like Polycarp, like John, lived into their 90s and hundreds, so there are people still alive from Jesus' time, even when John's Gospel is being written. That's the nature of the biblical authorship here, of the Gospels, what we're taking a look at. Now, to juxtapose this, to compare this with other books, let's take a figure from ancient history who's very well known, Alexander the Great. The first major biography written about Alexander the Great came 400 years after he died. So you compare something like 40 years to 400 years, there's no comparison. Now, I'm giving you 40 years for the Gospel of Mark, but the fact of the matter is the Gospels aren't the only things we can use for the historical evidence here, and we are going to use more. There was somebody who wrote even before the Gospel of Mark was written. His name's Paul. Paul wrote letters which obviously were written before he died. Kind of hard to write them posthumously. Unless he too had risen from the dead, but that's not the investigation tonight. Paul's letters, therefore, are written earlier than 65 AD. Some of his writings, though, contain doctrines and codified proclamations from the early church that he was quoting. So, for example, if I quote something in a letter, let's say I quote the preamble, or if I quote the Bill of Rights, whatever, I quote something from the late 18th century in my writing, that's still from before. Even though my writing is from the 21st century, I'm quoting something from earlier than that. Paul does the exact same thing in some of his writings. One of these is a very well-known creed from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8. Let me give you the context here. A group of scholars who are not Christian, or at least not Orthodox Christian, they're called the Jesus Seminar. Many of these people are atheists and agnostic, and they attempt to revisit what the New Testament says and how accurate it actually is. So these are people who publish some of the most anti-Christian literature that's out there. They were investigating the New Testament to grade whether certain verses are historically reliable and whether certain verses are not. When they came to 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, they concluded that these verses are so early that they come from within a decade of Jesus' death. Like I said, these are not Christian scholars, or at least not what we think of when we think of Christian scholars. They're saying within a decade or so of Jesus' death. Now, some scholars who are very highly respected, such as James D.G. Dunn, he's a retired professor from Durham University in the UK. He goes much further. He says that 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 8, is in fact so early that we can be virtually certain that it was codified within months of Jesus' death. Can we compare 400 years on Alexander the Great to months after Jesus' death? That's about as fast as anything can possibly be from historical times. And if you want me to read for you what 1 Corinthians 15 says in these verses, I will do so. It says this, Paul says, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me." Scholars have concluded, James D.G. Dunn, one of them, that this comes from within months after Jesus' death. What is it saying? It is saying that Jesus died and rose from the dead. Now, that doesn't mean this is automatically true, just because it comes from within months after Jesus' death. That doesn't mean it's automatically true. But what it does mean is the community is preaching Jesus' death and resurrection that soon after he was crucified. And the people who were around at the time of his ministry, the people who claim to have seen him, are still there, which is why Paul says he appeared to the 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Why does he put that qualifier in there, most of whom are still alive? Well, he's telling them, look, if you want to see people who have seen the risen Jesus, go verify what I'm saying. Let their testimony be proof for you that this happened. So, what is the nature of the evidence we're looking at tonight? I still haven't gotten to the point where we build a case yet. We're just taking a look at the nature of the evidence. Do we throw out the Bible beforehand? No. We see it as historical documents, or at least those parts that purport to be historical. Then we weigh them for how reliable they are. We try to sift past their biases, just like we would for any historical document. And we also have portions that are so early that they're within months, theoretically, after Jesus died, or perhaps a decade or so, but still a newsflash according to ancient standards. That's the strength of the historical testimony for what we're going to be looking at tonight. So now that we've seen kind of the weight of the historical records, and we've taken a look at whether or not we can actually investigate the question, let's take a look at the actual argument. The argument that I'm going to provide for you comes from two scholars, very highly acclaimed scholars within certain circles. One is a distinguished professor at Liberty University. The other is a professor at Houston Baptist University. Their names are Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. Gary Habermas is an amazing man. He himself went through an extended period of doubt regarding the resurrection, and he made it his doctoral research to investigate the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection in the mid-70s. Since then, he has read every single scholarly article on the resurrection and on the death of Jesus, printed in English, French, and German. He's got a lot of time on his hands, apparently. So he goes through every one in all those three languages, and he catalogs what all these scholars believe. Over 3,500 articles he's read, cataloging what scholars believe. Now, which scholars is he referring to? Atheist, agnostic, skeptical, Hindu, Jewish, Christian, across the theological spectrum. He takes what all of them write and he catalogs what they conclude. What he has found is that certain facts about Jesus' death and resurrection, or at least the time surrounding his death and resurrection, are so commonly adhered to, not just by Christians, but by non-Christian scholars, that they're virtually unanimous amongst those who are studying the historical Jesus. Once again, there are certain things that pretty much everyone who studies Jesus agrees about Jesus. One of those facts is that Jesus died by crucifixion. About Jesus' death by crucifixion, you have scholars across the board, once again, who agree that it happened. People like Paula Fredrickson, who's an agnostic or an atheist. You have people like Marcus Borg, Bart Ehrman, who's himself agnostic, saying things like this, that Jesus died by crucifixion is as sure as any historical fact can be. If there's anything we can know about the historical Jesus life, it's that he died by crucifixion. So the scholars across the board are saying fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number two that Gary Habermas points out is that the disciples of Jesus truly believed he had risen from the dead. The disciples truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. Again, that doesn't mean he had risen from the dead, but they actually believed it. They weren't lying about it. And fact number three, that not just the disciples of Jesus believed that he had risen from the dead, but enemies of Jesus, specifically Paul, who was Saul of Tarsus, who was arresting Christians at the time, and also those who didn't follow Jesus, such as James, his brother. We know from the Gospels that James was not a follower of Jesus during his lifetime, and yet all of a sudden he becomes a follower of Jesus to when he's willing to die for the fact that Jesus had risen and appeared. So these three facts, Gary argues, as well as Michael Licona, argue that are solidly established within the historical record. So let's take a look at the reasons why we can believe that these three facts occurred. Fact number one, did Jesus die by crucifixion or not? The process of crucifixion during Roman history was so thorough that no one in all of Roman history that's been recorded ever survived a full crucifixion. Not one person ever survived a full crucifixion. Why? Let's take a look at what a crucifixion is. When someone is going to be crucified, and I'm sorry if this gets a bit graphic, but the fact of the matter is there are people who deny the death of Jesus on the cross. I was one of them. Throughout my young adulthood, I denied that Jesus died on the cross. But when I saw this evidence, for me, this was so compelling that it challenged me, it shook me to my core. Because the Quran says Jesus did not die by crucifixion, and yet here was the evidence. Here, take a listen to this. The process of crucifixion starts off with flogging, and we see from the Gospels that Jesus was also flogged, and this is a normal for the crucifixion process. The flogging involves using a Roman flagrum, a whip. This whip has multiple leather cords that come off of it. Each of these leather cords has multiple leather balls, which on those leather balls have metal dumbbells and shards of sheep bone. So you've got a whip, multiple cords, leather balls with metal dumbbells and shards of sheep bone. The victim is then tied to a flogging post, and this whip is used to hit the victim repeatedly. The whip is designed the way it is because the metal dumbbells cause vasodilation of the blood vessels near the skin. The blood vessels dilate, pain receptors and chemicals are brought closer to the surface of the skin, it's going to hurt a lot and you're going to bleed a lot. They were very systematic in the way they designed their crucifixion process. The sheep bone was then designed to reach into the skin, latch onto it, and rip it out. People would bleed to death by the flogging process. Some people's intestines fell out during the flogging process because the whip would reach around to their abdomen, weaken the abdominal wall to the point where the intestines fell out. Cicero records that people's arteries and veins were laid bare during the flogging process. That's why it was called the pre-death. People died during the flogging alone. It's also interesting to note that the people who were doing this to Jesus were not Jewish at this point. These were the Roman soldiers who were flogging Jesus. And the reason why that's important to note is because Jews had a law from the mitzvot, from the Old Testament, that they were not to flog anyone more than 40 times. So Jews would have someone actually counting. As they were flogging, they'd have someone counting how many times a person was flogged. And once they got to 39, they would stop, just in case someone had miscounted. They wanted to make absolutely sure no one broke God's law and went to 40 or 41. Romans, especially at this time, were very spiteful of the Jews. And so oftentimes they'd get to 40 and start whipping even more, just to spite the Jews and their laws. And so the fact that Jesus was being flogged by Romans makes us think there's a chance that his flogging was worse than the average flogging. And there's more reason to think that, actually, because you look at the Gospel of John. In the Gospel of John, it's pretty clear that Pilate, the person who's crucifying and flogging Jesus, doesn't want Jesus to die. He's trying to release him. So he tells the crowd, look, I've crucified him, I've flogged him, isn't that enough? Isn't that enough? Now, of course, they were expecting him to be flogged already, so what sense does it make for him to say, oh, he's flogged, isn't that enough? It would only make sense if he had flogged him worse than they were expecting. So we have good reason to believe, for two separate reasons, that Jesus was flogged worse than the average person. And as Cicero has said, it's one of the most gruesome processes. If any of you want more information on the crucifixion process, read Martin Hengel's book, Crucifixion. He provides some historical records in there that are so compelling. For example, no one other than Roman non-citizens were allowed to be flogged and crucified. The crucifixion process was so bad that citizens weren't allowed to be crucified. In fact, people have said, let no Roman even think the word crucifixion. That's how painful and devastating and humiliating the flogging and crucifixion process is. But it's not done yet. After a person's skin is hanging off from them in ribbons, they are then placed on a cross. Now, that's not a gentle process by any means. A person was often made to carry the cross beam through the streets as a sign of additional humiliation. Look, they could kill you by beheading you if they wanted to. The crucifixion process is designed to humiliate you and weaken you and prolong the process of death. And so Jesus is carrying the crossbeam to the place of his crucifixion. And of course that happens while he's bleeding and naked. They don't allow any clothes while that's happening. Once they get to the place of the crucifixion, their hands are nailed. And hands in that time applied to anything from your fingertips to your wrists. They were nailed right here, through the ulna and the radius, because that's where your weight could be sustained while you're hanging. Nailed through there. There's a nerve that runs there. It's called the median nerve. This is the major sensory motor nerve of your arm. If you pierce that nerve, your hand is immediately incapacitated. And if you can imagine tapping your funny bone and how much pain that causes, imagine piercing a nail through it. There's a reason why they had to invent a word to describe the crucifixion process and how painful it is. The word excruciating means ex cruce, off the cross. This is an excruciating process. You've got nails driven through both sides here, and then you have a 7-inch nail driven through your feet. The reason why a nail is driven through your feet is because if they hang you up by just your arms, you're going to hang and you're not going to be able to breathe out after a while. You're not going to have the strength to pull yourself up in order to breathe. You hang, your rib cage is extended, you don't have the ability to provide that negative pressure to breathe in, and you're going to die of asphyxiation. So what they do is they nail you through your feet so you can push up off your feet. to continue breathing. This is not a mercy. It prolongs the death of someone until they decide to finish you off. When they do that, there are multiple ways, but there was always a Roman death blow involved in the process of the crucifixion. These death blows sometimes looked like knees being broken. You see in the Gospels that the people next to Jesus, their knees are broken. Why is that? Because if you break someone's knees, they can no longer push up in order to breathe. So they die by suffocating. Or sometimes bodies were lit on fire while still on the cross. In fact, when the Jews were revolting after Jesus' death, right before the temple was destroyed, one of the things that the Romans did was they crucified Jews in various positions and lit their bodies on fire all around the city of Jerusalem. It said that their bodies lit up the place like torches. People's bodies would be lit on fire. Sometimes people's bodies would be taken down and thrown to a pit of dogs, and the dogs would eat them. In fact, scholar John Dominic Crossan says this is likely what happened to Jesus. He's a member of the Jesus Seminar. You can tell he's not Christian belief. He says that Jesus' body was fed to dogs. Sometimes people's heads were crushed. Now Jesus, what happened to him? He was speared through the heart. That was the death blow administered to Jesus. The Romans are making absolutely sure you die by this process. And like I said, not a single person ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. I throw the word full in there because one person is recorded to have survived a partial crucifixion. He was put up on the cross and immediately taken down because a general saw him and recognized him as a friend. So he said, "Take him down." This was Josephus. They took him down, gave him the best medical treatment they had. In fact, 3 were taken down at once. 2 of them died. 1 survived. That's the only person ever recorded to survive any part of a crucifixion, but no one ever survived a full Roman crucifixion. For these reasons, scholars take a look at the evidence and they conclude across the board, Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. And I do want to take a moment here to bring in some extra biblical evidence. This isn't just records found in the Bible. You have people outside the Bible, Jews, Romans, and Greeks, outside the Bible, non-Christians, who are saying that Jesus died by crucifixion. Lucian of Samosata, for example, Josephus, the Talmud, Marabar Serapion, who is also a Jew. All these people are saying that Jesus died by crucifixion. None of them are Christians. All of them are early. None of that's from the Bible. So we have extra-biblical, non-Christian evidence that corroborates this, which is why it is such a strong claim. Fact number 1, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number 2, the disciples truly believed Jesus had been risen. Now the disciples were at one time so afraid of fighting and dying that they ran away from Jesus. They ran from him. They weren't willing to stick around when Jesus was being arrested. But something happened. And shortly after Jesus' crucifixion, these people are so willing to say that Jesus had risen and appeared to them that they're all transformed to the point where they're willing to die for this belief. They're willing to die for the sake that Jesus had risen and appeared to them. Something transformed them from essentially cowards to essentially bold enough to not be afraid of death. What was it? What could that possibly be? Now they're saying it was the resurrection. They saw the author of life himself risen from the dead. That's why they had that kind of boldness to die, because they know death had been defeated. But on top of that, we have other reason to believe that they were telling the truth. And that is something very pithy that Mike Licona says. He says, liars make poor martyrs. Liars make poor martyrs. They died for their beliefs. Now, someone might say, Nabeel, people die for their beliefs all the time. We saw people in 9/11 willing to kill themselves for the sake of their beliefs. Are they right too? That's not the point I'm making. Because what people believe today and are willing to die for is usually beliefs that were taught to them from the ancient past. The disciples were testifying to something they would have seen with their own eyes. Not something that they had been taught, something they would know to be true or not. And that's why they make poor martyrs, and they're probably not lying. If they were lying, they'd make poor martyrs. So, did the disciples honestly believe Jesus had risen from the dead? Across the board, Gary Habermas has said over 90% of the scholars who study this say yes, and we've just provided the reasons. Finally, Fact number 3, did enemies of Jesus believe that he had risen and appeared to them? Now, Paul, like I said earlier, was someone who was arresting Christians. He had no reason to accept or want to see the risen Jesus. He hadn't followed Jesus. He hadn't been one of his disciples. In fact, he was a student of a top rabbi of the time, Gamaliel, one of the highest rabbis, and he was one of his best students. He had power coming his way. He had plenty of reason to want to stay within the Orthodox sect of Judaism and not follow this new Christian subsection of Jews. So why in the world would he have been willing to die, and in fact did die, for the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead? Once again, the argument is made that he truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, whether he's right or not, we haven't gotten to yet. But he at least truly believed Jesus had risen from the dead. And James as well, the brother of Jesus. You take a look at Mark chapter 6, and what you find is that Jesus' family is not following him. Jesus' family is not one of those who is agreeing with the early Christian community. They're saying Jesus is out of his mind. But James, the brother of Jesus, we see in the book of Acts, and we also see from extra-biblical evidence, that James, in fact, was not just a follower of Jesus, he became a leader of the church in Jerusalem. And then he was killed for believing Jesus had risen from the dead. The evidence that he was killed is found extra-biblically, like I said, in Josephus, in the 2nd century Hegesippus as well. We have good records showing that James and Paul, neither of which were following Jesus, were willing to go to their death for the fact that Jesus had risen. Therefore, they believed Jesus had truly risen. Are you with me so far on these 3 facts? Jesus died by crucifixion. The disciples truly believed he had risen from the dead, and the enemies of Jesus truly believed he had risen from the dead. Here is the job of a historian, and this is where we draw everything together. The job of a historian is to take evidence and facts from history and provide an account that best explains those facts. You see an array of facts. What theory best explains those facts? If you have a theory that strains the facts, that's a bad historical conclusion. If you have a theory that accounts for the facts very well and comfortably, that's a good historical conclusion. Now, it should be said up front, no theory accounts for all the facts perfectly, but some definitely account for the facts better than other theories do. So what theory can best account for these 3 facts that we have just investigated, that virtually all scholars across the board who study this matter are in agreement with? I'm positing tonight, based on the minimal facts argument of Habermas and Lakota, that the only hypothesis that answers these facts well is the resurrection. No other hypothesis comes even close to explaining these facts. That's my argument tonight. Now let's assess that for a moment. The hypothesis of the resurrection. Does it explain fact number 1, that Jesus died on the cross? Yes, it accounts for that. Jesus died on the cross. Number 2, does it explain that the disciples of Jesus truly believed that they had seen him risen? Yes, it does. If Jesus rose from the dead and they saw him, that explains why they truly believed that they had seen him. Fact number 3, does it explain that enemies of Jesus truly believed that they had seen him risen? Yes, once again, if Jesus actually rose from the dead, that accounts for all 3 of those facts. It accounts also for why enemies of Jesus believed they had seen him risen. Hypothesis number 2. Now I'll tell you this. Gary Habermas has said that this hypothesis is the most popular hypothesis after the resurrection. But that said, only 5% of the scholars he surveyed believe in this. It's the most popular after the resurrection, but only 5% of the scholars he surveyed believe in this alternative explanation. It's the hallucination theory, that Jesus' disciples had followed Jesus, and they so wanted to see him risen, that after he died, they saw him risen. And how are they explaining this? Well, it's a true medical phenomenon. When people lose loved ones, they often hallucinate their loved ones' return. They hallucinate that they're back. So, appealing to that medical phenomenon of hallucinations of the recently bereaved, they're saying that the disciples really saw Jesus risen. They believed that they had seen him risen, but it was just a hallucination. Okay, so that's that hypothesis. Does it fit the 3 facts? Fact number 1. If they were just hallucinating, does the fact that Jesus died on the cross fit? Yes, it fits. It fits that theory. Number 2. If the disciples were just hallucinating, does it fit the fact that they truly believed they had seen him risen? Well, this is a bit of a stretch. This is a bit of a stretch. Because it's not like there's one person who saw Jesus risen. Like I said, from something that maybe as early as 6 months after Jesus, 500 people at once saw the risen Jesus, or at least believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. So in order to avoid the miracle of the resurrection, you have to create a miracle of a mass hallucination. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. But for the sake of argument, let's just say, okay, fine, it fits fact number 2. Let's just say it fits fact number 2. Fact number 3, the enemies of Jesus truly believed that they had seen him risen. Does this fit? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Under the hypothesis that the disciples really wanted to see Jesus risen, therefore they did, how does that explain the fact that Paul saw the risen Jesus? It doesn't explain that. Paul didn't want to see, if anything but he wanted to see the risen Jesus. Yet Paul was willing to die for the fact that he had seen the risen Jesus. So the hypothesis that the disciples simply hallucinated doesn't fit the facts. What about the next most common hypothesis? After that, you're going to look at the stolen body theory, that the disciples stole Jesus' body. Well, does that fit fact number 1, that Jesus died by crucifixion? Yes, it does. Does it fit fact number 2, that the disciples truly believed that they had seen Jesus risen? No. If they stole his body, they didn't truly believe that they had seen him risen. It doesn't fit this fact. And of course, it doesn't fit fact number 3 either. Why were enemies of Jesus willing to say they had seen him risen if it was just that the body had been stolen? Doesn't fit the facts. All right, what's the next most common hypothesis? And this was a hypothesis that I had believed, that Jesus had simply swooned on the cross. He didn't die, he survived the crucifixion. Does it fit fact number 1? No. Fact number 1 is that he died on the cross. And to argue that he didn't die doesn't fit the facts. But also, it doesn't really fit fact number 2 either, that the disciples believed he had risen from the dead. Because if the disciples had simply healed Jesus after he had survived the cross, they wouldn't be then willing to die for the proclamation that he had risen from the dead. It doesn't fit the facts. And David Strauss, who was an atheist from the 18th century, was the first person to point this out. Back then, naturalistic explanations were pretty popular to explain what was happening to Jesus. David Strauss, a vocal atheist at the time, which was very rare, said this hypothesis simply does not work because the disciples went from being afraid to proclaiming Jesus the author of life. Now, if Jesus had just barely survived a crucifixion, that doesn't make him the author of life. That doesn't give them enough reason to proclaim the resurrection. And once again, of course, it doesn't quite fit with enemies of Jesus as well. From this point, we start going really downhill on the hypotheses. The next most common hypothesis is the evil twin hypothesis. Jesus had an evil twin who saw this moment to take control and take power, and then apparently disappear. Who knows? That's the next hypothesis, not really a good one. After that, we get into the super alien hypothesis, so it just goes even further downhill. The fact is that the best explanation for the facts surrounding Jesus' death is that he rose from the dead. It's the only explanation that works well. And because it's the only explanation that works well, you have, remember how I said that after the resurrection itself, the next most common hypothesis was only subscribed to by 5% of people. There's a whole host of people in there who say this: we don't know what happened. We don't know what happened. Most of the scholars studying Jesus' life conclude, we simply don't know. There's no historical explanation that can account for these facts. Well, I think there is. It's called the resurrection. Now, the only reason why people would preclude that beforehand is if they say miracles can't count. But if you rule out miracles before you start the investigation, you're not being fair. You are being biased in your research. And you've beforehand precluded the potential, and I would say the best explanation. This is why the same scholar I talked about earlier, Reza Aslan, said this. He said, something extraordinary happened. What exactly that something was is impossible to know. Jesus' resurrection is an exceedingly difficult topic for historians to discuss, not least because it falls beyond the scope of the examination of the historical Jesus. So he's saying what most historians say. But he says, however, there is this nagging fact to consider. One after another, those who claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus went to their own gruesome deaths, refusing to recant their testimony. So even scholars like Reza Aslan, who says, we don't know what happened, he grants the facts. He's just not willing to conclude a resurrection because he thinks that would be a miracle. And I think that's exactly what happened. So, we can at least conclude that there's good reason for Christians to have faith in the resurrection of Jesus because it is the best explanation of the historical evidence. No other explanation approximates this. Now, what I want to leave you with then is the fact that this isn't just an academic lecture. This isn't just a matter we study in order to ascertain the reliability of Christianity or to see why they believe what they believe. This has real ramifications for all of us who are sitting here. If we are living in a world where only natural things happen, and post-Enlightenment, especially in the university settings, it seems to be a popular belief in the West that only natural things happen, that there is no such thing as the supernatural. What this means, what the resurrection means then, is that that is wrong. There's something more to this world, something that can bring people back from the dead. And if that is true, then what that means for you is that if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like there is no hope, if it comes to a point in your life where it seems like even death is inevitable and there's no way to escape it, well, death is not the end. There's more. There's hope no matter what. Now, if it's someone who has risen from the dead, that's what that means. But the fact that it was Jesus who had risen from the dead tells us even more. Because what Jesus had been claiming was that you could live in eternity with God. That He loves you, that God loves you, and that He will provide for you. And His resurrection was the proof He was providing for these claims. Now, if it's true that you have Jesus, He's been risen from the dead, His claims have been proven true, then what that means is that you can be with God for eternity if you follow Jesus. That means that your life here can be spent, poured out for the sake of others. That means you don't have to be worried about anything in your own life because you're in the hands of a God who's all-powerful and all-loving, who loves you in specific. That filters down to such a high level. Jesus was that person who was willing to spend time with sinners and prostitutes and tax collectors, according to the New Testament. Jesus was that person who was loving even the lowest of the low. So right now we have in Atlanta tens of thousands of people trapped in sex slavery. And I'm telling you, some of the things that keep them there is the constant lie that they are told that they aren't worth anything. They're told that the best use that they have is their body being sold for money. They're being told that verbally, they're being told that by the actions under which they are trapped. And quite frankly, if there is no supernatural, if all we are the chemicals that comprise us, then they're not worth anything more than that. And the most value we can extract from them is utilitarianism, which is what's happening to them. They're spawning this industry by their bodies being sold. But if God, if Jesus, if the gospel message is true, if Jesus' resurrection happened, which provides epistemic basis to believe in the gospel, then that means that even that person caught in sex slavery can believe that they are loved. Not just by anyone, by the God who created the universe. Not just that they are loved, but they're so valuable that God Himself would be willing to die for them, and then willing to defeat death for them. No message can give someone more value than that. This has very real ramifications. And for us here, for those of us here who do live in Atlanta, if this message is true, if Jesus is risen from the dead, then we ought to follow Him and follow what He says. And what He says is, be willing to suffer and die for the sake of those who need you. Be willing to pour your life out for those who need you. If Jesus died on the cross for the sake of us, which is what he said, and which is what he would have proven if he had risen from the dead. He tells us, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, who is our neighbor? Those very people caught in sex slavery. He gives us a reason to then empty ourselves out for their sake. And this might be hard to swallow, not just for their sake, but the sake of their captors and the criminals as well. We're supposed to love everyone because they are truly valuable and worthy of love. This all becomes true if Jesus is risen from the dead. This has tremendous ramifications, and I think it's an amazing blessing, speaking from a Christian perspective, that God has given us reason to believe in it. He didn't have to, but the history is that strong that we can have solid reason to believe in it, not just have to believe in it by blind faith, but be able to put our claim on this, on the strength of the historical evidence. And based on that, lives are being transformed. Mine is one of them. Mine is one of them. I would have never said anything like this if the case for the resurrection had not been this strong. But because it is, I'm willing to follow Jesus. And the question is, where do you fall? Thank you so much for giving me a hearing. We're going to now go into question and answers. Thanks.